So next we have Viktorija Bilic that will talk about using CAT tools for translating historical letter collections. So
yes, I'm here. We're putting up my PowerPoint. My name is Viktorija Bilic, and I'm an associate professor of translation studies at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. And my talk today is entitled Using CAT Tools for Translating Historical Letter Collections, Limits and Possibilities. So this will be my talk today, just a brief outline and overview. I will start by describing historical immigrant letters as text types, as they are not typical, and you can debate whether this is even literary translation. We will get to that. And then I will talk about the historical letter translation process and focus on how I used CAT tools for translating historical letters, what were the limits, what were the possibilities, and then I will come to a conclusion. So this is just gives you an impression of what I'm looking at when I mean historical letters. My research has been focused on this text type for over a decade now, and I will just give you an introduction of the text type in the context of German immigration to North America. Okay, so German immigration to North America peaked in the 19th and early 20th century, with more than 5.5 million Germans immigrating to the New World, as they called it, in search of a better life. As a result, historian Wolfgang Hellwig estimates that between 1820 and 1920, approximately 280 million letters were sent to Germany by newcomers to the United States. And of course, personal letters in general are difficult to define. Several scholars have emphasized that personal letters as text types are difficult to define since they may contain a wide variety of different contents and writing styles. So decoding and researching immigrant letters, in my experience, can feel like solving a puzzle. The letter writers generally knew each other well, and they did not explain their multiple backgrounds, contextual backgrounds. They did not explain people and events mentioned in the letters. And so the translator has to find answers. And also, a lot of these people were not very well known. So you find your answers in archives by doing a lot of archival research. Milwaukee, where I teach now, is known as German Athens, or auf Deutsch, Deutsch Athen. And in 1910, half of Milwaukeeans claimed German ancestry. This is just an impression of what is there. There were, in the 19th century, German schools, German newspapers, German books, German theaters, and also plenty of German brewers in the city. And 19th century newcomers to Milwaukee basically did not need to learn English, as German was spoken everywhere. This here, Wisconsin Banner, was a daily newspaper, and you can see that Wisconsin was spelled the German way. That was also common. Stadttheater today is the Pabst Theater, and there were dictionaries called Amerikanische Dolmetscher, all printed in the city of Milwaukee. So there's no shortage of these documents that my research has been focused on, documents related to German immigration in archives in Wisconsin. So I'm in the right place for my research interest. Who was Mathilde Anneke? I will talk about her because my most recent book project was related to her immigrant letters. And she was a German-American feminist and writer who lived most of her life in Milwaukee. I will be talking about her a little bit just to give an introduction because I doubt very many people will have heard of her. She was a so-called 48er, a lecturer, a newspaper editor, an abolitionist, a suffragist, and a mother of 7, 3 of whom survived to adulthood. She was born in Hiddinghausen, Prussia in 1817. She was radical also in the sense that she left her first abusive husband, Alfred von Tabouillot, in 1839 and moved to Münster with their daughter, and she later divorced him when it was, of course, in those days, it wasn't typical to get a divorce, especially not initiated by the woman. She wrote her feminist manifest, Das Weib im Konflikt mit den sozialen Verhältnissen, Woman in Conflict with Society, in 1847, and she dedicated it to her second husband, socialist Fritz Anneke. They married that same year. In 1848, they were 48ers, meaning they joined the armed revolutionary forces in Rastatt, Baden, and after the failed revolutions, they fled Germany, arriving in Milwaukee in 1850. This is where Mathilde Anneke began publishing her feminist pro-suffrage newspaper, Die Deutsche Frauenzeitung, in Milwaukee, and where she became a vocal advocate for women's rights. In Milwaukee, she developed a relationship with abolitionist Mary Booth in 1858, and they lived together in Zurich, Switzerland from 1860 until 1865, while Fritz Anneke fought as a Union soldier in the American Civil War. Mary Booth died in 1865, and Mathilde Anneke returned to Milwaukee and opened a school for girls, das Töchterinstitut. She led her school until her death in 1884. She wrote several novels, poems, and short stories, but of course, she's not very well known, except for maybe in Wisconsin. And the archives at the Wisconsin Historical Society in Madison contain about 2,000 personal letters. These are some examples, some letter scans from my archive. I couldn't translate 2,000 letters, so I focused on the Civil War era letters, and the project is a collaboration between a professional translator, me, and an expert historian, Alison Clark Effort at Marquette University in Milwaukee. And it is focused on the years between 1859, so a little before the Civil War started, and 1865, because this was a fascinating time during which Mathilde lived in Switzerland and frequently exchanged letters with her husband, Fritz, who served as a soldier in the Union Army in the United States, which was also not unusual for Germans to do. About 10% of Union soldiers had German ancestry. The book was published this year, the English letters, under the title Radical Relationships, the Civil War Era Correspondence of Mathilde Franziska Anneke. And it contains introductions and numerous footnotes. And since in this case, I had to create my original source text, I also want to publish the German originals, and they will come out with Steiner Verlag, hopefully next year. Translating the letters. Now looking at the translation challenges, none of these suggest casual use. They are all considered to be creative challenges. Mathilde and Fritz Anneke were both prolific writers, and their unique writing styles were challenges. Personal writing, of course, is also different from their professional writing. Then elliptical writing, this is this phenomenon that no context is provided. Letter writers share information and they both know what they're talking about, yet now we have to decode it almost 200 years later, and it is not as easy. So elliptical writing, meaning you have to fill in the blanks. You might find your answer to what she is describing in one letter in just another letter. Individual abbreviations, of which she had many. She also tended to personify the newspapers she wrote for. For example, when she writes Die Augsburgerin, she really means the Allgemeine Zeitung. Things like that, I think you learn by close reading and analyzing and doing archival research. Irony and sarcasm was a fun challenge, realia in general. Neologisms and German English word creations were a challenge. For example, fashionabel for fashionable, or she says die Papers, meaning the newspapers, the papers, or just spelling candy the German way, things like that. And another challenge were literary quotes and references. Heinrich Heine, whom she kind of knew a little bit, is cited frequently. And of course, when she cites him, she doesn't say, "Dear Fritz, I'm going to cite Heinrich Heine now," but it just appears in the middle of a sentence with no quotation mark. And then the translator has to realize this and be on high alert. Is she citing a famous writer, a famous philosopher, a famous poet? And in these cases, I then quoted an official English translation, if such a translation existed, and then provided the translator's credits in those footnotes. And just general 19th century language could also be described as a translation challenge. My strategy and my goal, or scopus, was to inform a modern audience about this correspondence, while also approximating the author's writing styles and 19th century language in the translation. The translator is visible, and it is mostly a foreignized and overt translation. This is also because there are numerous footnotes per chapter. There are 7 chapters in general, and there are up to 100 footnotes per chapter, because in historical editions, generally, footnotes are very common, and the translator is visible through that. I'm also mentioned on the book cover as the translator. So in general, everyone who picks up this book will know it is a translation, of course. Also because the originals were written such a long time ago. Steps in the historical translation process, and then I will get more to the topic of CAT tools. First, creating a digital archive. The Wisconsin Historical Society let me scan all of the 2,000 letters. And then, of course, those need to be organized. You need to come up with a file system and things like that. Then the translator needs to create the source text for this type of translation. So selecting, transcribing, and editing the source text for translation is the second step. Researching letter protagonists and backgrounds, that often involves archival research. Analyzing the writing style of letter correspondence, translating from German into English, revising and editing the letter translations. And now, what about CAT tool use during the translation phase? It is helpful, but not in the pre-translation phase, and I will get to this. The most helpful tools in the translation process for historical letters, among others, was on-site research. I did research in archives in the US, Germany, and Switzerland to be able to contextualize information about people and events mentioned in the letters. And this information is not easily Googled. So I did a lot of on-site research. Etymological dictionaries in both source and target language were helpful. Online corpora and parallel texts to verify 19th century language use in source and target language. And then CAT tools, and I will focus on computer-aided literary translation and not literary machine translation. So this is what one letter looks like. For those not familiar with Kurrentschrift, I don't think it looks very legible. But once you are used to reading text like this, it becomes much easier. In the beginning, I needed charts like this, or whenever I work with students, I give them charts like this until they get used to the handwriting. What's also noticeable is thin paper and using up a lot of space to save paper. And then sometimes the background is shining through. So that doesn't exactly make things easier, or suggest I could just pull this into a CAT tool or a machine translation tool and it will do the work for me. So this is really what the translator has to do herself. Transcription phase. I would say that the translator's assignment goes beyond what is typically involved in the translation workflow. CAT tools are not helpful during the phase of transcribing and creating the ST. Because OCR, optical character recognition software, is still lacking when it comes to recognizing handwritten content in general, and especially when written in an outdated 19th century script. However, the translator will have to do this work anyway outside of the CAT tool. For experienced readers, I would say it really is easiest to manually transcribe all letter content line by line and as accurately as possible, keeping each author's individual styles of punctuation, inconsistencies, wrong or spellings, misspellings, spelling variations, and so on. This is just one example. Names weren't spelled consistently, so it wouldn't make sense to add this to a CAT tools term base, because I also want, in my translation, I wanted to keep the inconsistencies. So whenever she writes Milwaukee the German way, that is also spelled like this in my English translation as kind of like a foreignized, more overt translation element. Segmentation. For translating historical letters and literary translation generally, it can make sense to use paragraph-based segmentation rather than sentence-based segmentation in cases when the content is clearly not very repetitive anyway. Then fragment matches could potentially be helpful. In my case, that has not been my experience, but theoretically it could happen. However, another characteristic of personal letters is the lack of punctuation or long sentences. So because the sentences were often long anyway, I decided on using sentence-based segmentation, and I used MemoQ for this letter corpus. So this is just one example of a rather long sentence that is not likely to get a lot of matches because she repeats it exactly in the same way. So that's another limit. And then even for short sentences, you can see that there's a lack of, I meant to go back, sorry. There's a lack of repetitions and full or fuzzy matches. So it's not a text type where you would say CAT tool use makes the most sense, or anyone would use CAT tools because you want to keep, there are so many repetitions and specialized terminology, which is usually an argument to use CAT tools. However, there are also possibilities, so positive aspects of using CAT tools. First, the side-by-side setup. I think project management works better when using a CAT tool. You have an overview of your translation editor. CAT tools automatically keep the formatting. You can also work with an editor who doesn't use CAT tools and import the word edits back into the tool. That's always possible. So I guess I don't see the way, the real reason why CAT tool use would hamper creativity per se. There's some specialized terminology related to the fact that her husband Fritz was a soldier, and of course I added that to the term base, but there is not a lot of that specialized terminology. But when it does come up, I integrate it in the term base. There are not very many repetitions as previously stated, but they do occur at times, and then mainly in the greeting and closing of letters. And CAT tool use enables translators to keep such repetitions very easily. And then another positive aspect for me, I think, is you are building a corpus for future projects. So building TM corpora is beneficial for translating similar projects in the future, as they can serve as parallel text databases or reference TMs and concordance and context searches can be easily conducted. So to come to a conclusion, I will say that unlike highly specialized medical or technical texts, historical immigrant letters are certainly not ideal candidates for CAT tool translation due to both content and format. However, in my view, using a CAT tool does not hamper creativity during the historical translation process. A lot of people say they feel the structure is too rigid in the tool. I actually like the side-by-side overview. And as I said, it's always possible to proofread and edit the target text outside of the CAT tool for a more contextualized view, and then import edits back into the tool. I think it's important how translators use CAT tools. So terminology verification and consistency checkers are much less important in historical translation, but then you don't have to use them. There are features that are helpful and keep the translation process more organized. So for the actual translation phase, I think the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. However, as I've outlined before, historical letter translation is also about creating your source text, and that still is a manual process. And CAT tools don't help much with that. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Viktorija. Very nice. Let's see if there are questions. Okay, so I don't see any in the chats, but I have one in the meantime.
Okay.
So, might not be, so I like this question, but might not make that much sense because I'm not really in translation. But yeah, you mentioned that your scopus was to inform a modern audience on one hand, and also that you wanted to use preserve 19th century language in the translation. I was wondering whether these two aims could clash with each other at some point, because the modern audience might not be comfortable or might be difficult for them to read 19th century language in the target language.
Yeah, so it's not a completely foreignized translation. I did also employ strategies of more domesticated translation. For example, when the sentence is 2 pages long, it is definitely not that in English. So my aim is also for it to read well in English. And so in that example I showed with the segmented view, that was one long German sentence, but in English it's 3 sentences. So it is not completely overt in that sense, that it is also very readable. I hope, or at least that was also the publisher's goal and my editor's goal. It is very readable in English as well, but it has some of that historical language in there. So I tried to avoid words that are very modern.
Okay, so you keep maybe all language, but that you think is understandable to a modern audience.
It is understandable to a modern audience. I meant this like informing an audience about this conversation or communication in the past by giving them the background information they need to fully understand that. I also do that for the German originals that will be published. The German originals also provide that background information about these people because they were not well known, and sometimes information doesn't make sense if you don't know who were these people she talked about. So there are also historical introductions per chapter, and that's what I meant here. I didn't mean it's a completely foreignized translation and very difficult to read, although I tried to keep some of that historical flavor in the translation, and I also avoided modern language and kept more to historical and antiquated words at times.
Okay, yeah, I think I've gotten it now, thanks.
Thank
there is a question by Christina.
Okay.
Let's see, thanks for your interesting paper. How did you come up with the idea of using CAT tools for these projects? Do you regularly use them in your work as translator or translator trainer, or do you want to test them in this particular project?
Yes, I have always used CAT tools in my work. And especially in technical translation, makes a lot of sense to use them. So I was used, and I also teach CAT tool courses at the university. So I'm not going to say they're in my DNA, but I'm very used to working with CAT tools. And I was just trying to see why not also make use of some of those functions without fully being aware that it doesn't help, that it's not an ideal candidate, but I just like the CATL overview and having the source text and the target text all in one window. And as I said, you could also just use the CATL for a first draft and then say, okay, I'm now going to print out the Word version and read it out loud, and then import edits later into the tool, or not. You could also just use it for a first draft. So it didn't hamper my creativity, and so that was my reason to use it. But I have worked with them before, yes.
Okay, question by Leonardo.
Mm-hmm.
Or a comment. Thanks, Victoria. I did like you stress you're using LCAT and not LMT. I did the same translating Samuel Beckett's letters, and CAT came very handy for translating notes.
Right. Thank you very much. Yes, I agree.
Okay, we still have time for one. I don't see in the chat. So in the meantime, I'd like to ask something quickly about creativity.
Mm-hmm.
So because you use this sentence level segmentation, so the literary translators I work with, they complain about this. They say, because we have segment level segmentation, I feel that I have to keep the sentence to sentence. So, and they say sometimes I want to merge or split, but you said even you have segment to segment, you gave one example where you said, oh, this is very long, I split it in 3. So
correct. And I also merged, and it's very easy to just merge sentences. So when there were short sentences, I would also merge the source text at times. Although translating into English, that is less of an issue than when I translate into German, because in German I would merge the source text segments, and when vice versa, because just of the nature of the German language with its long sentences. But I feel like you can still change this. You are not forced to also keep one sentence in the source as one sentence in the target. You can just merge those. Or you could change it later during the editing phase and just use the CAT tool for your draft.
Sure. Anne says, is it possible to ask a live question? Yeah, that's fine with me.
Okay, sorry, it's just a bit long to type it, so I just easier to say it if you don't mind. Yeah, coming from an experience, I suppose I have over the last 12 years been translating similar 19th century letters from Italian into English. And at the start, CAT tools weren't as widely available as they are now. And I think the point you make about project management is really important. I think that's their main benefit. The area where I have found them I suppose less helpful is the area of inconsistencies. And I just wondering if you could speak about that in your letters, where you almost, where letters are quite particular in that you'll have a terminology spelt different, but you'll also have it used differently. And if I'm correct, your corpus has also got multi-authorial voices. So you've got different people writing. It's not just one person writing a letter.
Yes, right. So she is communicating with her husband, and we're fortunate to also have his responses. So
I have correspondence with different people, so all across Europe and across the world, and there's huge inconsistencies across them. And that's somewhere where I found the CAT tools, which are designed to bring consistency, if you like, to translation. Right. And to maintain that consistency in it, that's really an issue. And I'm just wondering, how did you deal with that?
Okay, sorry. I maintain that inconsistency by whenever she misspells a certain place name, I also kept that in the translation as kind of like an overt element, the way she spells Milwaukee in the German way, for example. I did not try to bring consistency into the corpus when it wasn't there in the original. Like I didn't add terms to the term base that I didn't want to be made consistent. Just when there were really, I always only add specialized terminology to the term base and never just general words, because I don't want to introduce a consistency when it's not there in the source text. So these were really just for the military ranks that come up.
All right, thanks again. Time's up, unfortunately.
We answered the question, okay.
Yes, very good, thanks.
Okay.